He was the face of speed on the screens, the hero who lived on the edge in every scene. But when the engines went silent and the end credits rolled, the real shock didn't come from the box office. It came from what he left behind. When Paul Walker died in 2013, the whole world mourned the loss of an icon. But far from the flashes, in an isolated warehouse in California, something far more intimate, secret, and disturbing began to be revealed. Behind locked doors, there was a universe almost no one knew, more than 30 ultra-rare cars, some never seen by the public, others not even legally allowed on American streets. But what left everyone stunned weren't the vehicles. It was the hidden notes, the unfinished projects, the silent charity plans, and a legal structure so complex it turned a garage into a battlefield. What started as cataloging a collection became a painful journey, full of layers, where each car told a story, and many of those stories, Paul seemed never to want found. This is the real, dark, and surprising account of what they discovered in Paul Walker's garage after his death, and why even today, his closest friends still cannot forget. For years, Paul Walker was synonymous with speed, adrenaline, and cars that defied the laws of physics. But beyond the fame earned in Fast and Furious, there was a side the public rarely saw, the reserved man, obsessed with performance, who lived as much under the hood as under the spotlights. Paul didn't collect cars to show off. There were no guided tours, flashy videos, or boastful posts. His love for machines was almost silent, personal, sacred. He built, tuned, tested. He was meticulous. He wanted to understand each torque curve, each engine noise, each detail of a machine's soul. And that passion, contrary to what many think, didn't stay only in the movies. After his tragic death in a car accident, his family and partners were forced to face a devastating mission: open his private garage and decide what to do with everything he left behind. And it was then that the world began to discover the true dimension of what Paul built, and kept hidden. The place was an industrial warehouse in Valencia, California. No external signs. No ostentation. When the gates opened, what they saw looked like a sanctuary. More than 30 extremely rare cars, some considered relics, others kept in total secrecy. Cars never photographed, some without plates, without registration, and in some cases, not even legalized in the United States. There were models one only sees at restricted exhibitions: Ford GTs, Porsche 911s, Toyota Supras, a true fleet of Nissan Skylines, many personally modified by Paul. One highlight was a 1995 BMW M3 lightweight, so rare that fewer than 130 were produced worldwide. Paul didn't have one, he had 5. And each seemed kept as if it were a museum piece. But that was only the surface. The collection was carefully organized, but it wasn't a showroom. It was a workspace. Some vehicles were dismantled, others with handwritten notes stuck to the dashboard or hidden inside glove compartments. And that's when the story began to change in tone. What they found weren't just cars. They were messages. Fragments of thought. Personal memories scattered among engines and upholstery. Handwritten notes described how certain cars made Paul feel when driving. One, inside a Skyline, read, "Feels like I'm flying. Smooth. Furious. Alive." In another, inside an M3, it was written, "Maybe the cleanest left. Never sell." But the most striking of all, according to accounts, was inside a GTR. A small blue post-it, with only one sentence. "This one is Meadows. One day she will drive." Each discovery added a new emotional layer to what once seemed just a millionaire collection. The notes didn't speak only of horsepower or suspension adjustments. They spoke of dreams, intentions, of a legacy being built in silence. And at that point the investigators realized, that place wasn't just a garage. It was a mechanical diary. Each car, a chapter. Each engine, a memory. And many of those chapters were unfinished. Tools still lay beside ongoing projects. Some cars were partially restored, others with tape marking tasks like weld frame, fix rear noise, or simply run and test. But while family tried to grasp the emotional dimension of the garage, one detail began to catch the lawyer's attention: many vehicles weren't under Paul's name. And that detail would spark a conflict he probably tried to avoid in life, but that would become inevitable. As the cars were inspected, photographed, and cataloged, one question arose that no one wanted to ask: who really owned all that? A good part of the fleet wasn't registered under Paul Walker's name. The documents pointed to a tuning and performance company called Always Evolving, an organization Paul co-founded with friend and fellow driver Roger Rodas, the same who died with him in the tragic 2013 accident. At first glance, the company seemed only a high-end shop, specialized in customizing supercars and competing in races. But in practice, it worked as a kind of legal shield, a shelter where the vehicles were registered, bought, maintained, and even traded, all with maximum secrecy possible. That model offered advantages: identity protection, tax benefits, discretion. But it also created a tangled web of ownership. Some cars were partially paid, others had invoices issued under the company's name, and many didn't even have ownership titles formalized. It was a legal maze. And when Paul was gone, what once was a functional network became a ticking bomb ready to explode. The family, led by his father as a state executor, and his daughter Meadow as main heir, had to face what Paul never imagined leaving to others: a legal trail nearly impossible to decipher. While lawyers tried to organize the assets, the closest friends were summoned to help identify the cars, their stories, and above all, their intentions. It was at this point that the garage began to speak in a way no one expected. Inside glove compartments, central consoles, even hidden panels, fragments of handwritten paper began to appear: technical notes, reminders, scribbles, observations on car behavior on track, torque responses, ECU commands, and suspension details. But it wasn't the data that left everyone paralyzed. It was what was behind them. A note inside a Nissan Skyline read, "I feel like I'm flying. Smooth, furious, alive." Another, crumpled among wires in a BMW dashboard, carried the message, "Maybe the cleanest left. Never sell." And then the most devastating. On a simple note, written with a blue pen on a post-it stuck to a GTR's visor, it read, "This one is Meadows. One day she will drive." These weren't phrases crafted to move. They were intimate words, spontaneous, written by a man who never thought they'd be read by anyone else. And each message revealed something deeper than the car's value. It revealed the emotional bond between Paul and his machines. They weren't trophies. They were companions. Parts of his identity. And most impressive? Not all cars were complete. Several projects were in progress. A Datsun 240Z was completely disassembled, with notes taped to the body indicating the next steps. A classic 60s muscle car had adhesive tape on the dash with handwritten tasks: check carburetor, replace exhaust, balance axle. Beside those cars, tools remained on the floor where he had left them. Wiring harnesses hung halfway. Panels open. Loose bolts. They were cars that never ran. Chapters he couldn't finish. For those who lived with Paul, that was an emotional blow hard to endure. It was like walking through an interrupted sanctuary. Each silent engine seemed to hold the breath of someone in a hurry to live, but without time to complete. But among the incomplete cars, one detail drew attention. Some vehicles were marked with mysterious acronyms stuck to their panels. Notes with the letters RO, others with the phrase charity auction, or even ROWW written on improvised labels. It didn't take long for the pieces to fit. Reach Out Worldwide, the NGO Paul Walker created years earlier, dedicated to humanitarian aid missions after natural disasters. There were cars he had selected to be auctioned in charity events. A modified Supra. A Mustang Boss 302. None of them famous on screen, but all prepared with a purpose, helping anonymous people, far from the spotlight. And that was perhaps the hardest moment for the family. Knowing that, even quietly, Paul had been planning to use his private collection, his most intimate passion, to save lives. These cars weren't hidden out of ego. They were protected because they had a destiny not yet reached. Understanding this changed the course of the whole investigation. That garage, once treated as a millionaire inventory, was now seen as something much more powerful, an extension of Paul Walker's soul. But the more intimate and moving the discoveries were, the more complex the legal situation became. Because where there was emotion, there was also paperwork. And where there was memory, creditors appeared. The estate would soon face a conflict that not even the fastest cars could avoid. When the gates of that garage were opened, no one expected the real challenge would come from outside the engines. Because under the shine of rare machines, behind the emotional notes and the silent legacy of Paul Walker, arose an uncomfortable truth. No one knew for sure who owned what. With the estate under the responsibility of Paul's father and his daughter Meadow, then only 15, began a meticulous and painful operation to understand where the actor's personal collection ended and where the business assets of always evolving began. But what should have been a technical process turned into a human drama. Incomplete documents, unregistered cars, vehicles with financing still open, verbal agreements never formalized. It was impossible to move forward without hurting someone. And the cruelest part, Paul hadn't left this ready, because he never imagined he'd have to. In little time, voices began to rise. Creditors, ex-partners, former company collaborators. People claiming to own a share of the fleet. Others saying they had financed restorations. Negotiations left halfway. The garage turned into a battlefield. In an attempt to calm the situation, part of the cars was sent to public auction. In 2020, 21 vehicles from Paul's collection were sold at the Barrett-Jackson auction in Arizona. The total raised exceeded $2.3 million, but it was only a fraction of the estimated value of the complete collection, around $18 million. Still, not all the cars were auctioned. Some were quietly kept within the family. Others, traded in silence, far from the media. And there were those with documentation too fragile to be sold. They remained stored, as if still waiting for Paul. What no one could foresee was the emotional damage left behind. For Meadow, entering the garage was like walking through her father's last thoughts. The cars were more than vehicles. They were traces of moments, plans, personal rituals. Each key, each sticker, each note taped to a dashboard brought back a piece of him. The Porsche radio was still set to the station he used to listen to. The GTR seat kept the exact driving position. It was as if he had gone out for a ride and somehow was still about to return. Some close friends couldn't even enter. Others froze, as if that space were sacred. Some were moved by the unfinished projects. One of the cars had blue tape on the dash, handwritten by Paul. Check tire pressure, paint mirror, change oil. It was simple, but there was his life. In details the world never saw. And all of this hurt. Because the pain came with a brutal realization, none of it was made to be seen. Paul had no plans to display that collection. There were no spotlights. No marketing strategies. Not even an intention of turning the garage into a public attraction. Everything there was built in silence. For him. For his peace. For the almost spiritual pleasure of understanding, assembling and preserving machines that told stories without words. And yet now, those stories were being rewritten by inventories, spreadsheets, lawyers and figures. What was visceral became bureaucratic. What was pure turned into contested property. And there was still another ghost haunting that garage, Roger Rodas, the friend who died in the same crash. Some of the cars had been purchased jointly by the two. Others belonged to Roger, but were stored with Paul. With both families sunk in grief, and the company being dissolved after the tragedy, figuring out who should keep what became a pain impossible to manage. There, among steel and carbon fiber, were also shared memories, garage laughs, assembly nights, cold coffees on top of the hood. And no paper, no legal document, was capable of saying who had more right to those moments. In the end, what they found in Paul Walker's garage wasn't only a valuable collection. It was an incomplete map of everything he loved. A time capsule, made of interrupted dreams, intentions still in motion, and gestures he never had time to finish. Each car sold carried a piece of it. Each car that stayed, too. And that duality, between what went away and what remained, is what hurt most for those who stayed. At first glance, what Paul Walker left locked in that warehouse was a millionaire collection of rare cars. But in the end, what emerged from the rubble of bureaucracy, pain and time, was something infinitely deeper, an emotional legacy built with silence, dedication and true love for what moved him. The documents could say they were only machines. The lawyers could turn each model into figures, titles and disputed properties. But whoever stepped inside that garage truly understood something else. The cars were only the beginning. Paul didn't collect cars to impress. He didn't use fame as leverage to raise values or to feed a public persona. On the contrary, everything there was hidden on purpose. He didn't want a stage. Didn't want likes. He wanted connection. With the engine. With the moment. With the memory. Each hidden note, each pending adjustment, each car without plate, without name, without ending, spoke of a man who lived intensely, but not for the world to see. He lived to feel. And maybe that's why what they found in that garage wasn't just shocking. It was transformative. Because there, where they expected ostentation, there was humility. Where the public saw an action star, there was a passionate mechanic. Where they imagined a Hollywood idol, there was a father who wrote on a simple paper, "This one is Meadows." To this day, some of the cars remain stored. Others ended up in the hands of collectors who may never understand the real weight of what they hold. But there is something no sale, lawsuit, or auction can erase. The certainty that Paul Walker wasn't playing a character. He was what he showed to be. And what he left locked in that warehouse wasn't a fortune, it was a mirror of his soul. Paul Walker's garage became, unintentionally, his most honest testament. A place where the noise of engines mixed with the silence of unspoken emotions. Where passion wasn't marketing, but the raw material of everything he was. In the end, what most surprised those who entered there wasn't the collection's value. It was discovering that, even without cameras, even without public, Paul remained exactly who the world believed he was. And maybe, for those who remain, that is the greatest revelation of all.